Good morning. It's good to see you. Aren't you glad you're a Christian? All right, let's say last week's memory verse together. If you do well, will not your countenance be lifted up? And if you do not do well, sin is crouching at the door, and its desire is for you, but you must master it. Genesis 4:7. Many people are fascinated by the courtroom. There have been dozens of daytime TV programs like Judge Judy and Judge Joe Brown. And there have been many legal thrillers and courtroom dramas written and made into movies like those of John Grisham and Scott Turow. And they're constantly coming out with these legal TV series about sharp-tongued lawyers and judges like Law and Order and LA Law. And we're often intrigued by the heated arguments and the wading through the evidence and cases where justice is finally served in the end. And so much is decided in the courtroom. The courtroom decides who is at fault, who will get custody of the children, how much will be paid in damages, the penalty for the law that was broken, and so forth. Well, today we are going to be looking at something of a courtroom drama. So if you would, let's be turning over to John chapter 18. The crucifixion of Jesus is, of course, one of the most important events in Christian history. But I want us to take a look in these next 2 weeks at how the chief priests got Jesus killed. It's recorded for a reason. And I think there are a number of good lessons that we can get from it. Cornelius Tacitus, a well-known first-century Roman historian, he was writing about Christians and said this: Christus, Christ, from whom the name had its origin, suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of one of our procurators, Pontius Pilatus. But before we start looking at Jesus before Pilate, we need to get the context. In chapters 18 and 19 of John, we enter into the climax of Jesus' life. We're able to examine some of his final hours before his death and his burial. And it was around the time of the Passover, our April, and Jesus and his disciples were in Jerusalem. Well, chapter 18, it began with Jesus' arrest at the Garden of Gethsemane, and then his questioning at the residence of the high priest. And we can see his attitude and actions as he was betrayed by Judas and then questioned by Annas. And we can see Peter's mistakes as he first tried to defend Jesus and then denied that he knew him. Well, at the high priest's residence, they were engaging in what lawyers call, from what I understand, a fishing expedition. Grasping at straws in something of a pre-trial investigation. They're trying to get some kind of confession out of him or something, some material out of which they can frame an accusation. Well, with that in mind, let's dig into our text, and we'll begin with what happened when they first brought Jesus to Pilate, starting in verse 28. And I've asked our brother Ken if he'd read for us today.
Then the Jews led Jesus from Cyprus to the palace of the Roman governor. By now it was early morning, and to avoid ceremonial uncleanness, the Jews did not enter the palace. They wanted to be able to eat the Passover. So Pilate came out to them and asked, "What charges are you bringing against this man?" "If he were not a criminal," they replied, "we would not have handed him over to you." Pilate said, "Take him yourselves and judge him by your own law." "But we have no right to execute anyone," the Jews objected. This happened so that the words of Jesus had spoken, indicating the kind of death he was going to die, would be fulfilled.
John decided to skip over that official session of the Sanhedrin that we read about in the other Gospels. Being the last gospel written, this is pretty common, where John, he passed over quite a few things that were covered by the others. Well, after his questioning at the high priest's residence, first before Annas and then before Caiaphas, Jesus was brought before the Sanhedrin, or the chief priests at the council chamber, for something of an official trial. See, the Sanhedrin, that was the highest ruling court of the Jews. And the other Gospels make it sound as if it was extremely hurried. Boy, they wanted to get to Pilate as soon as possible. Now let's talk about Pilate for a minute. He was only mentioned by a few early historians, and about the only physical evidence we have of him is this block of limestone found in Caesarea in 1961 with his name on it. And he was apparently dedicating a building to Caesar. Well, since Palestine was under Roman control, the provinces were governed by procurators or governors. Pilate, he was the 5th Roman procurator of Samaria and Judea, and he ruled from about AD 26 to 36. His job was to govern the non-Roman citizens of the province. And his headquarters, they were in Caesarea, but he frequently went over to Jerusalem. He was probably there at this time to keep order during the Passover. Now, one thing you need to realize as we're looking through our text here is that Pilate and the Jews had no love for each other. As the Nelson's Bible Dictionary says, he greatly angered the Jews when he took funds from the temple treasury to build an aqueduct to supply water to Jerusalem. Many Jews reacted violently to this act, and Pilate's soldiers killed many of them in this rebellion. It may be this or another incident to which Luke refers in Luke 13, 1 and 2. Now that was where it talks about Pilate mingling their blood with their sacrifices. And we can read about some of the other things that he did in the writings of Josephus, Philo, and Eusebius. Well, this term praetorium, it originally referred to the headquarters of a Roman army, but it was later used for the residence of a procurator. And this could have been at the palace built by Herod the Great or at the fortress of Antonia. That was a military barracks that overlooked the temple. We're not told. And the Greek word for early here, according to the lexicons, was normally used to refer to the 4th Roman division or watch of the night, which is between 3 and 6 a.m. Very early. At least to me. I don't like mornings. Well, some people think that Pilate, he was available at this hour because he had been forewarned about the situation. But others argue that, the Romans, they just like to start their work at the crack of dawn to get it over as early as possible in the day. I don't know, maybe so they can get a round of golf in. But I wonder if the Jewish rulers wanted it to happen before too many people woke up to be able to protest to what was going on. So there were a lot of people who liked Jesus. Now, at this time, the Jews, they believed that the dwelling places of the Gentiles were a no-no, all right? They were unclean, and if you entered one, you would be ceremonially unclean for a time. And since it was the Feast of Unleavened Bread, maybe they were worried about leaven being in the praetorium. So they were trying to avoid ceremonial uncleanness. How pious and devout and conscientious of them. Never mind the fact that they are condemning an innocent man, and not just any man, but the Son of God. You talk about hypocrisy and completely getting your priorities out of order. As Jesus said to the Pharisees in Matthew 23, "You blind guides who strain out a gnat and swallow a camel." See, it's clear from Scripture that you can be very religious and yet not right in the eyes of God. And that's something that we all need to keep in mind. Well, some think that there's a contradiction here in verse 28 when it says that they did this so they could eat the Passover. Wait a minute, didn't Jesus and his apostles already eat the Passover on the previous night? Well, what you need to realize and remember here is that the Passover went for a week with the Feast of Unleavened Bread, Exodus 12:18. And the term Passover was often used to refer to the whole festival of Passover and unleavened bread. As Jackson explained, it is also the case that the term Pascha, Passover, can refer to the entire 8-day period, which included the Feast of Unleavened Bread, thus from the 14th of Nisan to the 21st. There were several feasts during this period. The one mentioned in John 18:28 may have been on the day following the main Passover supper. It was called the Hagigah, sacrificial meal. So I think John just meant that they were trying to avoid defilement for the remainder of the Passover festival. It says that they led Jesus into the praetorium. And so it seems that Jesus was inside, and he didn't overhear this first exchange between Pilate and the chief priests. They wouldn't come inside, and so Pilate, he went out to them, and we're not told, maybe it was on a balcony of some kind, like a veranda over the pavements in front of the residence, or maybe it was something like Mel Gibson portrayed in The Passion. But Pilate, he asked them about the charges against Jesus. It's really hard to know how much Pilate already knew about the situation. And they answered, "If this man were not an evildoer, we would not have delivered him up to you." And you may be thinking, what kind of an answer is that? And you're right. Okay, they're not bringing him to be examined, but to have their sentence confirmed. Their judgment should be sufficient, you see. They wanted Pilate to accept their verdict and simply order the execution. So it seems that their first ploy was to avoid, if possible, naming any charges at all. Pilate then said, "Take him yourselves and judge him according to your law." And I think he said, "Look, if you're not going to tell me, just quit wasting my time. Go take him and judge him in your little court." And so I'd much rather be watching Netflix. And so we learn here why the Jewish leaders brought Jesus to Pilate. We are not permitted to put anyone to death. Okay. You see, they wanted the death penalty. And the Roman government, they had to approve and execute the sentence. The Romans had deprived them of the right to execute criminals on their own. Professor Blomberg, he commented, "The claim that the Romans retained the sole right of capital punishment has often been termed a Johannine error, especially in view of the counterexample in the stoning of Stephen, Acts 7:58. But this right is strikingly confirmed by a passage in the Talmud, which says that capital punishment had been taken from the Jews 40 years before the destruction of the temple in AD 70. Stephen's stoning reads more like mob action, which defied technical legalities. So it sounds as if it was a fairly new law, but definitely a law during that time. You see, the skeptics, they're always claiming mistakes with the Bible. And usually all you got to do is just a little bit of research. And you find that the Bible, it comes out on top. Eventually, it's vindicated. Well, John, he then added that the word of Jesus might be fulfilled, which he spoke signifying by what kind of death he was about to die. You see, if it wasn't for this Roman law, surely the Jews would have already executed him, and it would have been done by their normal method, which was stoning. You see, the Romans, they were the ones who practiced crucifixion. In John 12, Jesus said, "And I, if I be lifted up from the earth, will draw all men to myself." But he was saying this to indicate the kind of death by which he was to die. In Matthew 20, he said, "Behold, we are going up to Jerusalem, and the Son of Man will be delivered to the chief priests and scribes, and they will condemn him to death, and will deliver him to the Gentiles to mock and scourge and crucify him." Well, the Jews were compelled to make accusations, and so they did. Sure enough, they had their talking points. And John skipped over it, but Luke 23:2 says, "They began to accuse him, saying, 'We found this man misleading our nation and forbidding to pay taxes to Caesar, and saying that he himself is Christ, a king.'" The forbidding to pay taxes to Caesar is interesting because he taught the exact opposite. All right, let's continue here with verses 33 through 40 with Pilate's first questioning of Jesus and then his first attempts to release him.
Pilate then went back inside the palace, summoned Jesus, and asked him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" "Is that your own idea?" Jesus asked, "or did others talk to you about it?" "Am I a Jew?" Pilate replied. It was your people and your chief priests who handed you over to me. What is it you have done?" Jesus said, "My kingdom is not of this world. If it were, my servants would fight to prevent my arrest by the Jews. But now my kingdom is from another place." "You are a king then," said Pilate. Jesus answered, "You are right in saying I am a king. In fact, for this reason I was born, and for this I came into the world to testify the truth. Everyone on the side of truth listens to me." "What is truth?" Pilate asked. With this he went out again to the Jews and said, "I find no basis for a charge against him, but it is your custom for me to release to you one prisoner at the time of the Passover. Do you want me to release the king of the Jews?" They shouted back, "No, not him. Give us Barabbas." Now Barabbas had taken part in a rebellion.
Well, the chief priests, they wanted Pilate to understand this in the civil sense as a rival of Caesar. And so Pilate, he decided to go ahead and take up the case and ask Jesus about these charges away from them, these charges of treason. And Pilate, he chose the main one. Are you the king of the Jews? That is, are you claiming to be a king wanting to head up some kind of Jewish rebellion against the authority of Rome? And in the Greek, the "you" is emphatic. It's placed in the beginning of the sentence. Now, it could be that Jesus was not what he had expected. You? Of course, Jesus usually he never seemed to be what anyone expected. And maybe Pilate he already thought that this is just a silly charge just by looking at him. I mean, this guy, very humbly dressed man who was arrested without any of his followers, he didn't really fit the profile. Jesus then asked, "Are you saying this on your own initiative, or did others tell you about me?" Okay, I don't know about you, but if that had been me, okay, I would have been extremely intimidated standing there before a Roman official, someone who has got the authority and the power to execute me with a wave of his hand. But with Jesus, there's no cowering, there's no begging, there is no protesting of innocence. I mean, Jesus treated Pilate as if Pilate was not his superior. He just questioned him right back. Now, obviously, we're not Jesus, but as it's been pointed out, we need to be confident as well when we are being questioned and examined by non-Christians, keeping in mind that God has given us that opportunity to have an interaction with them and to stand up for the truth. 1 Peter 3:15. Now again from verse 28, it sounds as if Jesus was inside. And so he didn't overhear the charge, but I don't think he's asking for information here. And there's some different ideas of what Jesus was getting at. And McGarvey had an interesting idea. Had he been a king in that sense, Pilate would have been the one most likely to know it. The question also, by an indirect query as to the accuser, reveals to Pilate's mind that no Roman had accused him. He was accused of the Jews. And when had that restless, rebellious people ever found fault with a man who sought to free them from the galling Roman yoke? Well, whatever it was, Jesus' answer was not going to be an expected one. And so I think he might have just been simply preparing Pilate for his answer. And Pilate replied, "I'm not a Jew, am I? Your own nation and the chief priests delivered you up to me. What have you done?" And it seems that Jesus' response took Pilate by surprise, kind of put him on the defensive here. I think Pilate was saying, I really don't care. Why would I personally be concerned with Jewish matters? This is obviously their accusation, not mine. So what's this really about? What in the world did you do to stir them up? In other words, if it wasn't for the Jews delivering him up, they wouldn't be having this conversation. This is a Jewish thing. Well, Jesus then admitted that, yes, he is a king, and he has a kingdom, but it's not the kind that Pilate's thinking of. I mean, he certainly didn't seek to overthrow any political structure or anything like that. I mean, the kingdom and kingship of Jesus, that's in a class all by itself. It's not a physical political kingdom that's built or maintained by military might. And that, of course, is why he told Peter to put away his sword. Verse 11 of this chapter. And the only sword that his followers are to use to further this kingdom is the sword of the Spirit, which is the Word of God. Ephesians 6:17. Now, there are still people today, like the Orthodox Jews, who are waiting for the Messiah to come and to set up a physical kingdom, an earthly kingdom in Jerusalem. But according to the New Testament, that's not going to happen. The Messiah, he already came, and his kingdom, it already exists. It is a spiritual kingdom. Colossians chapter 1, verses 13 and 14. For he delivered us from the domain of darkness and transferred us to the kingdom of his beloved Son, in whom we have redemption, the forgiveness of sins. Pilate, he's well acquainted with royalty, but he actually couldn't classify Jesus with any kind of king that he knew. But there's at least something here with this charge of being a king, of him claiming to be a king. I mean, even if it's not at all what it sounds like. So Pilate, he said, so you are a king. It could be that he wanted to hear more. You know, I wonder if there was some growing interest in Pilate. Well, Jesus answered, you say correctly that I am a king. For this I have been born, and for this I have come into the world, to bear witness to the truth. Everyone who is of the truth hears my voice. And you may remember that Paul actually alluded to this in 1 Timothy 6. He said, I charge you in the presence of God, who gives life to all things, and of Christ Jesus, who testified the good confession before Pontius Pilate. Jesus said to bear witness to the truth. You'll notice as you read through the Gospel of John that the Apostle John focused a lot on truth in his Gospel. In fact, the Greek word for truth is found over 50 times in this Gospel in its various forms. And I'm reminded of what Jesus said in John chapter 8. If you abide in my word, then you are truly disciples of mine, and you shall know the truth, and the truth shall make you free. And John 14:6, I am the way and the truth and the life. No one comes to the Father but through me. Philosophers and scientists have searched for truth all throughout the ages, but many are like those mentioned in 2 Timothy 3:7, who are always learning and never able to come to the knowledge of the truth. But according to Jesus, those who are genuine truth seekers, they're going to come to the conclusion that he is who he says he is, and they're going to go to him for truth. If you think about it, this is an implied invitation to Pilate as well. Well, maybe Jesus was making him uncomfortable. I don't know. He asked the question, what is truth? Did he care? Is this a genuine question, or is he just being sarcastic? I mean, to me, it sounds like a sarcastic question revealing his disbelief in absolute truth. This is something that's very common today in our postmodern age, although some people refer to it as a postmodern age. See, according to the different polls and surveys that I have looked at, well, over 2/3 of Americans today do not believe that there is such a thing as absolute truth. Most people these days, they simply think that truth is relative and subjective. What's true for you is not necessarily true for me. It's just a sliding scale. I mean, hey, that's not my truth. Here's something else. What does truth matter in Pilate's line of work? I mean, for many politicians, there are often more important things to consider than the truth of a matter. I mean, there are things that are politically expedient, like their personal benefit or promotion or their agenda. Well, you'll notice that Jesus didn't respond to Pilate's question. Yeah, it could be that Pilate didn't give him the opportunity to go ahead and respond. When he had said this, he went out again. And even if Jesus had responded, I suspect it would have simply fallen on deaf ears. But whatever the case, Pilate, he was now strongly convinced of Jesus' innocence. And so he went out again to the Jews and said, I find no guilt in him. I mean, it's very clear to Pilate that Jesus is not heading up some kind of dangerous rebellion against Rome. He's not a dangerous rebel. Having a spiritual kingdom and teaching truth, whatever that is, I mean, that's not a criminal offense. To Pilate, Jesus, he's clearly a philosopher who is concerned about the kingdom of truth and not the kingdom of Caesar. And Matthew and Mark, they tell us that Pilate, he realized that it was because of envy that the chief priests had delivered Jesus up. I mean, he could tell very easily that this did not come from any just and noble motive. Well, as you know, jealousy and envy, that can cause people to do some very ungodly things. We need to be very careful when we start to get those feelings. Well, three times Pilate would say that he found no guilt in Jesus. Here, chapter 19, verse 4, and chapter 19, verse 6. Now, since he could not find any guilt, integrity says what? Well, he should have let him go. He should have set him free. We find Mark chapter 15, verses 3 through 5 here, after this first questioning of Jesus being a king. Now, this must have happened after Pilate gave his verdict that Jesus was innocent. And the chief priests began to accuse him harshly. And Pilate was questioning him again, saying, do you make no answer? See how many charges they bring against you. But Jesus made no further answer, so that Pilate was amazed. And you'll probably remember the prophecy about Jesus in Isaiah 53, verse 7, about him not opening his mouth. Now, he did speak from time to time, but he was silent when it came to protesting and arguing his case. He just let them say what they were going to say. It was his time to die. But even for us, all right, there is a time to be silent and a time to speak. Ecclesiastes 3:7. Well, in verses 39 and 40, Pilate, he tried a way to get Jesus released here by using this custom of releasing a prisoner at the Passover time. A lot of speculation. Really, we don't know the origin or the purpose of this custom. It's kind of like the president or a governor pardoning someone. Today we have that. Well, we learn from the other Gospels that Pilate, he actually gave them this choice. The choice between Barabbas or Jesus. And well, John says that Barabbas was a robber, one who steals by force and violence. And that is, of course, a different word in the Greek from a thief. A thief is one who steals by stealth. It's not a good guy here. And we learn from the other Gospels that that's not all. Okay, he was a notorious prisoner who was also an insurrectionist and a murderer. Okay, so which one do you want back out there on the streets? Someone who heals people and tells them to love their neighbor, or someone who robs people and murders them and stirs up insurrection? But Pilate's plan had backfired. And it didn't work. And now he's going to have to deal with Barabbas out on the streets again, out in the public. He thought for sure that the multitudes are going to side with Jesus. But Mark 15:11 says, the chief priests stirred up the multitude to ask him to release Barabbas for them instead. Many of the people, they feared the Sanhedrin. And as you know, people are often so fickle. Well, when Jesus was riding into town, the crowds are crying out, Hosanna to the Son of David. It's very easy to get caught up in the hype of the moment, whatever it is. And so that's another thing to be careful of. Also, many people, they just got bloodlust. They just want to see some kind of violence or killing. They get entertainment value out of it. Well, Acts chapter 3, Peter, he said to the Jews, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the God of our fathers, has glorified his servant Jesus, the one whom you delivered up and disowned in the presence of Pilate when he had decided to release him. But you disowned the holy and righteous one and asked for a murderer to be granted to you, but put to death the Prince of Life." They chose a murderer. And like Barabbas, they were about to become murderers themselves. The name Barabbas means son of a father. It's interesting that the son of the father died in his place. I mean, Jesus might have been crucified on the very cross that was intended for Barabbas. Well, as you know, he did much more than just die in his place, because he took your place, and he took mine as well. You notice that Pilate continued to use this title all throughout, the King of the Jews. I don't know, maybe it was to mock and to irritate the chief priests who had brought this just ridiculous charge against Jesus. Or maybe he thought that it would influence the crowds to decide toward the way he wanted them to decide. But as you know, this title, it would be put above Jesus' head on the cross. Well, the trial went on, and we can see that they threw everything they could think of at Pilate. First, trying to get him to simply take their word for it and condemn Jesus, 1830. Then, a political charge against Jesus, 1833. Well, as we're going to see next week, then a religious charge against Jesus, 1907. And amazingly, a threat against Pilate himself in 1912. So come back next week. There's a lot more to this and a lot more lessons, I think, that we can learn. Although he recognized Jesus' innocence and he had the authority to uphold justice, he ended up giving in to the demands of the crowd. And he ended up washing his hands of it. This is a temptation for anyone who holds a position of power, anyone who holds a position of some kind of authority. Pilate decided to sacrifice an innocent man rather than possibly to sacrifice his career. And like so many today, Pilate, he knew what was right. And he seemed to want to do what was right. But in the end, he wouldn't stand for it. The pressure was too great. And as you know, the Bible talks a lot about integrity. It talks a lot about justice and honesty and things like that. Will you and I stand up for what is right? Or, like Pilate, will we give in to what is expedient or politically correct? See, too many people, they worry more about their job, or they worry more about their reputation than they do about what is right and true and just. So what happened to Pilate after this trial? Well, from what I've read, in AD 36, the governor of Syria brought some serious charges against the guy. And the thing is, while he was traveling to Rome to defend himself, well, the emperor died. And Eusebius reports that he was banished to Gaul, where he eventually committed suicide. Not a happy ending. The happy ending is with Jesus, because as God planned, he was crucified, and after 3 days, risen from the dead. But it's so sad. The cynical, hopeless man who didn't believe in truth, well, he was right there, next to the one who is the embodiment of grace and truth. John 1:17. And sadly, he missed his opportunity. His life, it sure could have been different. It could have ended up in a very different place. He could have done like we believe his wife did and became a Christian later, after this was over. So here's the admonition. Let's make sure not to miss our opportunity.